So today we are going to have another one of our, what we would call nuts and bolts lecture, in which we have to look at some basic information. And in particular, this has to do with the Ruthenian Ukrainian world, the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Galicia during the second half of, well, it can be the chronological 19th century or the second half of the long 19th century. And that is the period from 1849 until 1914. And we're going to look at two particular developments, and that is the administrative structure of the Austrian Empire as a whole, and then specifically Galicia within that framework, and then socioeconomic developments specifically in the province of Galicia. We had spoken about the Great Revolution of 1848 spilling into 1849 that had begun in March and only ending in 1849 with the decisive defeat of the greatest threat to the empire, the Hungarians and the Hungarian kingdom. Following that, Austria entered a period of what we could call a return to absolutist rule, or neo-absolutism, as it is known. And during that time, the imperial administration, based in the capital, Vienna, attempted to undo the achievements of the 1848 revolutionary period and to restore absolute power, certainly of the emperor and his administration. And so for the next 2 decades, between 1849 and 1868, were to take place a series of efforts at trying to get a hold on how to run this empire, and if necessary, to restructure it. Each new attempt in change, that is, in change in imperial policy during these 2 decades, was influenced by the kind of interplay between external events and internal developments. In other words, the international situation, international affairs, and then pressure from within the empire, and in particular from the various nationalities living within the empire, and in particular the Magyars or the Hungarians. During this period, we can see 3 distinct phases, as I've marked here on the board. The first of these phases, 1849 to 1859, marked what I'm calling here the neo-absolutist phase, in which the government exclusively was under the control of the imperial authorities in Vienna. The second phase, 1860 to 1866, a time of constitutional experiment or experiments. And the third phase, 1867 to 1868, witnessing the creation of the dual monarchy. That is, the creation of a structure of distinct Austrian and distinct Hungarian lands. By the way, that was the structure of the dual monarchy that prevailed until the very demise of the Habsburg Empire in 1918. And it is really from that time that we can speak of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as opposed to simply the Austrian Empire. Now, as you can imagine, the developments during each of these phases that affect the empire as a whole had also an impact on the administrative structure of those three areas within the Habsburg Empire where Ruthenians, Ukrainians lived, that is in the province of East Galicia, in the province of Galicia, the eastern part of it, province of Bukovina in the Austrian half of the empire, and Transcarpathia in the Hungarian portion of the empire. So first, this neo-absolutist phase. Vienna, the authorities in Vienna proceeded to rule its empire directly from the capital, and in some cases, which included the Austrian province of Galicia and the Hungarian kingdom, through actual martial law. This was still the post-revolutionary era. People were very nervous. And so martial law was instituted in at least two portions of the entire empire, and those two portions affected Ruthenians, Ukrainians, because it was in Galicia and in Hungary that we had martial law. In Galicia, martial law lasted until 1854, after which an imperial civil administration was set up, headed by an office called the Viceroy, which effectively replaced the governor, just changed of name for all intents and purposes. That is the head of the imperial administration in each of the provinces of the Austrian half of the empire, and in this particular case, it was resident in Lviv, which was the capital. And as you can see from this map, the structure of the empire, the blue is the Austrian Empire, the Austrian half of it, where Galicia and Bukovina are in the light blue, and the Hungarian kingdom in the dark blue. The viceroy in each of the provinces, in this case Galicia, responsible only to the emperor, who appointed him in any case. And the whole province was also administratively reorganized into 19 regions. This little other province called Bukovina, its status varied throughout this period. Really, in many ways, it seemed to be uncertain. 1849, it's made a separate province. 1854, that is confirmed. But then in 1860, that is rescinded, and Bukovina is once more part of Galicia. As for Transcarpathia, this area in the northeastern part of the Hungarian kingdom, it remains as it had been before within the Hungarian kingdom. But from 1849, the end of the revolution, it was under military rule. That is, the whole Hungarian kingdom was under military rule, divided into military districts. And one of those districts was actually based in the town of Uzhhorod, which is present-day Ukraine on the border of Slovakia, within Ukraine, in Transcarpathia. And effectively, with that military district based there, the part of the Ruthenian population in Hungary, the larger part, was now placed under a particular entity, in this case a military district. However, it was under the nominal rule of one of their local leaders, a man named Adolf Dobriansky. Came to be known as the Ruthenian district within the Hungarian kingdom. It lasted actually only 5 months until March 1850. But the Transcarpathians, or more precisely at the time Hungarian Ruthenians, had a sense of self-rule, budding autonomy, but then after that, their homeland remained an integral part of the Hungarian kingdom, divided as the Hungarian kingdom was into these various counties, well over 70 of them. And each of those counties headed by a Hungarian. Now in Galicia, the first viceroy to function under this autocratic neo-absolutist system was a Polish count named Agenor Gołuchowski. Agenor Gołuchowski, large landowner from Galicia itself. Most important, he was a personal confidant of Emperor Franz Josef and also the immediate entourage of Franz Josef. Gołuchowski also represented a small group of Polish leaders, still a small group, and here we're talking about Polish leaders in general, in all the empires in which they lived. A small number of them who felt that the future of the Polish cause, that is, an eventual reinstitution of a state that no longer existed after 1795, and there were attempts at revolting against the Russian Empire, also against the Austrian Empire in 1846. But now this small group of Polish leaders felt that the future of their efforts did not lay in revolutionary activity, but rather in organic cultural and economic work with the masses, in particular their own Polish masses, who didn't really recognize themselves as Poles, but just as Roman Catholic peasants. So now let's turn to the masses and also cooperate with the three imperial states that ruled Polish territory at the time: Prussia, future Germany, Russia, and Austria. Gołuchowski was convinced that the Habsburg-ruled Austria offered the best political future for the Poles. And so he was more than willing to cooperate with the Austrian Habsburgs, provided that they recognize all of Galicia as a Polish land and that it grant complete cultural and preferably a degree of political autonomy specifically to the Poles living in this Austrian province of Galicia. In fact, this Gołuchowski was a dominant figure throughout the whole period. For example, he served as the Viceroy of Galicia during this period, no less than 3 times. Then for a while, he was the Imperial Minister of Internal Affairs. It was clear that the Habsburg Emperor Franz Josef needed a reliable administrator, and he trusted this Gołuchowski. Gołuchowski knew this. And taking advantage of, from time to time, Vienna's weakness, Gołuchowski was able to advance the Polish cause and transform Galicia, all of Galicia, into an area in which Poles monopolized the upper echelons of the administration, as well as the educational system, and in practice, economic life as well. And that situation was to last until the outbreak of World War I in 1914. That is throughout the rest of our historic 19th century. During the period of neo-absolutist rule that we're talking about here, before 1859. Gołuchowski successfully foiled any suggestions and sometimes attempts by the imperial authorities in Vienna to divide Galicia into two provinces. That would have effectively meant a Polish West Galicia and a Ruthenian East Galicia, totally unacceptable from the Polish point of view, as represented by Gołuchowski. So he foiled all of those efforts. He also succeeded in having many Austro-German officials in the province replaced by Poles, and in having Polish replace German as the language of instruction in secondary schools or gymnasia, senior high schools. Also in restricting the further spread of Ruthenian schools in general in Galicia. By the way, he even tried to introduce the Roman Latin alphabet for Ruthenian publications in 1859 instead of their traditional Cyrillic alphabet. That effort didn't succeed because of strenuous protest on the part of Ruthenian leaders, but he even went that far. Now the year 1859, as you can see on the cusp here, was a crucial turning point for Habsburg Austria. Why? In that year, it lost the war with France and the northern Italian kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia. Why Piedmont-Sardinia? Well, I mean, the Italians living in Tuscany and Lombardy, etc., always were until then under Austrian rule, and they wanted to get rid of Habsburg rule. And so this war takes place, and Austria loses. And that loss suggested internal weakness within the empire and the need for plans to restructure the empire, to make it more functional. Things weren't working out. This neo-absolutist approach to governing rule clearly wasn't working. And in its stead, the imperial government proposes a new solution in February 1861. February 1861, that's why we start this second period here, because that marked the dawn of the era of constitutionalism and representative government in Austrian history, Austrian Habsburg history. As a result of that, each of the provinces in the Austrian half of the empire, that is the light blue here, each of those provinces, eventually 17 of them, got its own diet, Landtag in German, Sejm, Soim in Polish and Ruthenian. And also, there was created an imperial parliament, or Reichsrat, with representatives from all the provinces now being elected to this imperial parliament located in the imperial capital, Vienna. Now, as for the Galician Diet, it had 150 seats initially. That number was increased, so that before the end of the empire, there were 228 seats in this Galician Diet. The Diet for Bukovina had 53 seats. The deputies to these provincial diets were elected according to a so-called curia system. Curious word. Curia, it's a Latin word, kind of like social rankings, if you will. And what was that curia system? Well, electors fell into various categories, 4 categories actually: the great landowners, chambers of commerce, towns, rural communes, and then after 1895, a 5th curia was added to include all male voters, so universal, at least for males. Now, these provincial diets had authority over matters that affected the daily lives of the inhabitants of their particular province, in particular agricultural matters, industrial development, health, hygiene, and very important, education. So they were functioning in many ways like provinces or states in the United States, provinces of Canada, states in the United States. So that was at the Galician level. At the imperial level, the Austrian parliament in Vienna consisted of two houses, a House of Lords made up of members appointed by the emperor, and the more important House of Deputies. This also sounds like Canada with its two houses. The number of deputies in the Austrian parliament also started low at 203 in 1861, but by the end of our period there were 516. Now this heritage, the very presence of Gołuchowski, was strongly felt in this new administrative structure. On the one hand, while the Ruthenians made up close to half of Galicia's population, they never had more than 1/3 of the deputies in the Galician diet. The largest number that they had was 66 out of 228 on the eve of the war. In Bukovina, where the Ruthenians also made up close to half of the province's inhabitants. Actually, they had no deputies at all until 1890, but then the largest number that they ever had was 17 out of 53. So they didn't have the equivalent of the Poles or the Romanians, for instance, in Bukovina, but they had deputies, and they were elected. That's the key. In the Imperial House of Deputies, that is the Imperial Parliament, the House of Deputies, which were elected, Ruthenians had at most only 1/4 of the seats that were allotted to Galicia. Again, their largest number on the eve of the war, they had 27 out of 106. Meanwhile, in Galicia, after Gołuchowski began his third term, precisely coinciding with the constitutional, the post-constitutional period now, he's back as provincial viceroy. From then on, every viceroy, every head of the Galician diet was a Pole. The marshals or the speakers of the Galician diet were all Poles, and all the district sheriffs in the various districts within the province were Poles. The next important turning point in Austrian history came in 1866. Again, it's the end of the second period constitutional phase. Again, international affairs. This time, it wasn't France and Sardinia-Piedmont, but Prussia. Prussia was under the dynamic leadership at the time of a famous 19th century figure, Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And under his direction, the Prussians defeated Austria in a lightning war that lasted no more than 6 weeks. In general, Prussia now had definitively pushed Austria out as the now dominant power over Germanic lands in Central Europe. Up until then, it wasn't clear who was going to have more influence over the Germanic lands, all these tiny little states, Prussia in the north or Austria in the south. Now, from now on, it was clear. And the culmination came in 1871 when Bismarck united all of these smaller German states under the leadership of Prussia to form the German Empire. That's when Germany actually as a state single state came into being in 1871. What was the implication, however, of this for Austria? Well, this loss to Prussia in 1866 was attributed to the failure of the Hungarians within the empire to cooperate in the war effort. Once again, Habsburg Vienna was forced, however reluctantly, to deal with and try to resolve the Hungarian problem. The Hungarian problem. And also try to respond to the continuing demands of the other nationalities living within the empire. Not easy to rule the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but they did it. What was the result then? Well, it was literally a compromise, which was actually what it was called. In German, Ausgleich. The Ausgleich reached in May 1867, implemented in 1868. Well, what did that mean? Now the Hungarian kingdom was left to govern itself only with the exception of foreign affairs, some economic matters, that is a common currency, tariffs, and the military, in which both halves would decide. That is the common concern of the whole empire. And it was as a result then of this Ausgleich of 1867, which took effect the following year in 1868, that, as I already said, the Habsburg or Austrian Empire was now transformed into the dual monarchy or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Of course, as we've seen, this Count Gołuchowski, he's back in office as Viceroy in Galicia, following Austria's defeat by Prussia. Again, Vienna wanted his support, and again, he was willing to give it so long as Polish interests in Galicia were enhanced. And how should they be enhanced? Well, in 1868, the very same year that the Ausgleich goes into effect, you know, from the standpoint of the other nationalities, why only resolving the Hungarian problem? What's so special about the Magyars? What about the Czechs? What about the Poles? What about other nationalities? Also have claims for more self-rule. And so within the framework of Gołuchowski's activity, something called the Galician Resolution is put forth in 1868. And what did this Galician Resolution demand? Wide-ranging political autonomy for the province, including now legislative authority to make laws. But the imperial authorities were not prepared to go so far, fearing, and rightfully so, that it would lead to similar demands, which were already on the table, by other nationalities, and therefore the possible disintegration of the whole empire. Of course, Gołuchowski, if Vienna still wanted his support, you had to give him something. Had to give the Poles something. So what did Vienna do? What did the Habsburg authorities do to assuage those discontented supporters of the Galician Resolution? As a result, the Austrian imperial government agreed to permit several administrative changes in Galicia. And what were those changes? Well, one language. Polish now became the language of internal administration and secondary schools, including the University of Lviv. Up until now, it was basically German, and now it's Polish. Also, the Galician Provincial School Board, theoretically subordinate to the Galician Diet, where there were also Ruthenian members, the school board, in effect, now became an instrument of the further Polonization within the educational system. And so while it is true that the Ruthenians, Ukrainians, clearly did participate in the political system, and they clearly were guaranteed certain legal rights for the promotion of their national culture, the realities of Austrian political life, both internally and on the international front, forced the imperial government in Vienna to depend on the elite elements in Galicia, and those elite elements continued to be the Poles. In effect, the Ruthenian Ukrainians became a functional minority in Galicia, forced to struggle for any advance in their national life in the face, more often than not, of intransigent opposition on the part of the Poles. And that situation effectively lasted until the end of our period in 1914. So much for the administrative structure. A few words now about the socioeconomic structure and developments of, specifically of Galicia. The basic description given that we use for the first half of our chronological 19th century, the province remains an underdeveloped agrarian region that functioned primarily as a supplier of raw materials for the more industrialized provinces in the western part of the Habsburg Empire. That applies to Galicia. By the way, it also applies to the Hungarian kingdom. Here you have agricultural products, some minerals, all to support the industries in the western part of the empire, and also to be a market for goods from the western part of the empire. This doesn't mean that there was no efforts at industrialization. There were, in particular during the very last decades of the 19th century, the 1880s and 1890s, so that Galicia's economy changed somewhat from that of an exclusively agrarian one to one in which there were some industry and a growing working class proletariat. Important also to keep in mind was numbers here, or demographic growth. On the one hand, the overall size of Galicia's population continued to increase. So at the beginning of our period, 1849, there were 5.2 million inhabitants. By the end of the long 19th century, on the eve of the war, close to 8 million. So from 5.2 to close to 8. On the other hand, the percentage of Ruthenians, Ukrainians, during this period, the percentage of them in Galicia actually declined. Even in the eastern part of the province, east of the San River, which was where the majority, East Galicia, majority classic Ruthenian inhabited area, even there, the percentage of Ruthenians declined from 71% in the beginning of our period until down to 62% in 1910. What were the reasons for this relative decline, where there's general growth of population in the province? Or was it an actual decline, or was it something else? Well, first of all, there was a sharp increase in the number of Poles from the western part of the province, moving into the eastern part of the province. Actually, no less than 178,000 Polish peasants settled in eastern Galicia from between 1890 and 1910. So it's a quite large number. Second reason for the kind of change in the relationship of the nationalities was that large numbers of Jews, actually over 800,000 by 1910, identified themselves as Poles in the empire's decennial censuses. A third factor was the emigration of Ruthenians abroad, beginning in the 1880s, primarily to the United States. And then the fourth factor was the tendency to assimilate into the Polish nationality, a tendency that was marked among the sons of Austro-German officials, as well as among upwardly mobile Ruthenian peasants and their descendants who migrated or who were born in eastern Galician towns and cities. It's therefore not surprising that the percentage of Ruthenian Ukrainians in urban areas also remained small. For instance, while the population of Galicia's administrative center, Lviv, quadrupled in size during this half-century before World War I, only 19% of its inhabitants identified as Ruthenians. So they were always in a minority in towns and cities in which Poles, and for that matter Jews, were the majority. Even in East Galicia, so-called Ruthenian inhabited East Galicia. It was the vast majority of Galicia's inhabitants, by the way, Poles as well as Ruthenians, who remained rural agriculturalists. Although the serfs, as we saw, were legally freed from bondage in 1848 during the Revolution, they remained, in a sense, economic serfs. And there were several reasons for remaining, if you will, economic serfs. The traditional right of the peasants to use the gentry-owned forests or woods and pastures, this was a traditional right, while they were proprietary peasants on the lands of the landlords. Now they're no longer proprietary, they no longer have that right. By the way, one would say, well, what's so important about the woods? Well, you have to heat yourself or heat your houses. And that's where they got picked. That's why the forests were so clean in much of Europe, because peasants were going around and picking up the wood on the ground. And so now that right, automatically they no longer have. The pastures, of course, they survive on cows. They have to pasture them somewhere. Now they have to pay for this. And their only source of income was from their limited amount of land. And this was insufficient. And hence they were forced to borrow money. They soon experienced chronic indebtedness. This sounds like many modern people who are indebted or serfs still today, except you don't have landlords, you have credit card companies. Same thing, practically. And so they have to borrow money, they can't pay it back, they can only pay part of the interest, and this cycle. And on top of that, their land holdings were constantly being subdivided among their offspring, because it was traditional when the male of the household died, you divided it amongst the male offspring. Now, despite a slight increase in available arable land, that was insufficient to offset the rapid demographic growth. As I said, the province's population almost doubled between 1869 and 1910. And so the peasant was caught in a vicious cycle of indebtedness, land subdivision, and rapid demographic growth. And this worsening situation led to frequent peasant protests, especially at the outset of the 20th century. I've already alluded to the fact that many of these Galician peasants from both parts of Galicia, west and east, sought relief by emigrating abroad. Beginning in the 1880s, Galicia's peasants, both Polish as well as Ruthenian, sought their fortunes in the New World by settling in the otherwise strange industrialized environment of the Northeast United States, where they found employment in the mines, in factories of America's rapidly expanding industrial sector. By the turn of the century, by 1900, the immigrants were also settling in Canada and Brazil, although in those countries, they went primarily to agricultural regions, so the prairie provinces in Canada, for instance. The large presence of Ukrainians here in Toronto is a result of a later immigration, not at this period. The result was that between 1881 and 1912, an estimated 430,000 Ruthenians left Galicia and Bukovina from the Austrian half of the empire, and then another 170,000 left Hungarian Ruthenia or Transcarpathia in the Hungarian part of the empire. And it is the descendants of those immigrants who still form a significant percentage of the Ukrainian community in the United States, the Ukrainian community in Canada, and of the Ukrainian, Carpatho-Russian, and to a certain extent, Russian communities in the United States. Why Russian communities? We'll elaborate on that next time. Actually, the only real way to stop immigration was to improve the Galician economy. And there were attempts to do that. First thing was railroad construction, begun in the 1860s, so that by 1914, a wide network of railroads crossed Galicia. By the way, all of these railroad lines, as you can imagine, all were directed south to Budapest or west to Krakow because it was part of the empire. These are the same railroad lines today. They haven't changed. Didn't make a difference whether it was Polish rule, Czechoslovak rule, Soviet rule. It's the same railroads that the Austrian, and the same tunnels through the mountains, and the same viaducts across the valleys. All goes back to this period. Another thing was investors were solicited not only from the imperial capital Vienna, but also from abroad, England, France, the United States, to invest in these budding industries in Galicia. And then the immigrants themselves who had left were beginning to send money back to their families in the homeland, all of these factors helped to improve somewhat the economic situation. And as a result of these developments, a modest industrial growth took place. Surprisingly, perhaps, the most remarkable growth was in the oil industry. One usually doesn't think of Austria, let alone Galicia, when we talk about the oil industry. One can talk about the United States, which actually began not in Texas, but rather in Pennsylvania, or Azerbaijan, Baku. Well, it's Galicia. Oil fields were discovered in 1880s, and specifically in eastern Galicia, in the basically Ruthenian part of the province, in two towns called Drohobic and Boryslav. Drohobic and Boryslav. Boryslav in particular There, financed and operated by Austrian, French, and English companies, oil production and an offshoot wax. Oil production increased 80 times between 1875 and 1910, at which time Eastern Galicia accounted for almost 5% of the entire oil production in the world. And by 1910, Galicia was among the 5 top oil-producing regions in the world. All in all, despite some industrial development, Galicia under Austrian rule continued to be economically underdeveloped agrarian society, and that description was even more applicable to those other 2 Ruthenian inhabited areas, Bukovina and Transcarpathia. Now, just to conclude, a little sidelight also of interest before we leave, and not unimportant. Most of the administrative, commercial, and industrial development in late 19th century Galicia was not directed by the Ruthenians, but rather by Poles and Jews. As for the Poles, their numbers continued to increase, not only in the province as a whole, as I've mentioned, but also in the eastern, so-called Ruthenian half of the province. And there it was that movement of Polish peasants into the areas, and mostly into rural areas. If you look at this map, you can see these dark dots. That's where Poles were in the majority. Not only did Poles dominate the administrative and economic life of Galicia, they also transformed much of eastern Galicia, especially the cities, the urban areas, into kind of oases of Polish culture. And so, for an example, in Lviv, or as the Poles would say, Lviv, in relatively liberal Austria, Lviv became one of the leading centers of the Polish national revival from among all the lands carved out of pre-partition Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. A host of Polish newspapers, publishing houses, theaters, cultural societies, schools. Lviv also boasted its own Polish language university, the Polish Historical Society, a distinguished library and research center known as the Ossolineum. And taking into account these factors, it is not surprising that Poles in 19th century Austria quite naturally considered Lviv, or Lviv, and for that matter, all of eastern Galicia, an integral part of the Polish patrimony. That other important people in Galicia, the Jews, also continued to expand their numbers and economic influence during the second half of our 19th century. So if at the beginning of the period there are 450,000 Jews, by the end of the period there are 870,000. Large numbers. They continue to remain an important factor in the Galician economy. By 1910, 76% of those Jews were engaged in commerce, industry, small handicrafts. And then with the beginning of this industrial development that I've been speaking about, during the last decade of the century, a few Jews were able to amass substantial wealth in Galician banking, oil, trade, industry,